Okay, so let me just share my screen with you, and then we're going to get talking about inferences and drawing conclusions in text. Okay, so what we're going to be focusing on is this idea of what it means to draw conclusions. We're reading through text, right? And we'll look at some different examples and kind of talk about some different contexts where we already do it, and then we'll excuse me, think about ways that we can do that in text as we're reading, right? Specifically this week, that's what your discussion is going to focus on. Is going to focus on this idea of how to be able to. What just happened? My thing went away. Hang on, sorry. There we go. Is we're going to be focusing on the idea of how to be able to draw conclusions in text, utilizing textual evidence we see as we're reading, right? That's what the ultimate goal being able to do this. So what do we already know about making assumptions? Like when people think about what it means to make an assumption, what does that idea mean to you? Situations where people make assumptions.
You're guessing. You're guessing based on the information you're given.
Exactly, right? So you're guessing based on information that you're given, and that's something that a lot of times we have to do, right? Like we may not have all the information. We may be to our own conclusions. The assumptions, you're absolutely like we're guessing based on information that we're given. The problem of making assumptions, and not that we don't make them all the time, sometimes we can assume correctly and sometimes we can assume correctly, but an assumption is just like, don't have sufficient evidence, right? Like not enough evidence to fully be able to come to the conclusion that we're trying to come to. So even though there could be where our assumption is correct, it's just an assumption, it's kind of a shot in the, right? It's like a little bit of evidence, then that's enough to be able to go on, right? And so this idea is that if we're ever coming to conclusions and we only have a bit of evidence or evidence is weak, then, right, we're just making an assumption. And we're going to look at situations where maybe that assumption can be correct and maybe that assumption may necessarily be correct. This is one of the things that we call this deductive reasoning, right? And this is a thing that I used to hear all the time. Right? People always say like, hey, you're a big guy, do you play football? Right? Like, so this idea of thinking about kind of coming up or deducing ideas, right? Almost like it's a mathematical formula, right? So this type of assumption is because one thing is true, then something else must be true, right? And it's all like works as like, if this is true, then B must also be true, right? So for example, we talk about, well, most people who play ball, right? All, but most people play football relatively big. So therefore, if you're big, you must play football. This is same idea a DJ Star Explorer in Dave's Single Story, right? That all members of a group must share a similar characteristic, right? So being a big guy all through high school, then all people who were big guy in high school must football or love ball, and couldn't have been further truth for me. So whenever we think of assumption, a lot of time what starts to have assumption is that we think about this idea we call deductive reasoning, right? And deductive reasoning is not necessarily bad. Like sometimes deductive reasoning can be helpful. But I think there are a lot of situations where maybe it only tells a small piece of the story. So for example, I don't know, maybe we could think about that with like the cost of something, right? Sometimes it could be like, oh, this person must have a lot of money. Well, how come? Well, we drive a nice car. And I know that car is nice and I know it's expensive. So with that expensive car must have a lot of money. Well, maybe that person, I don't know, when I'm in college, like one of my friends
Engineer stuff.
got really, really nice car that his mom helped him like sign for, right? But he broke all through college. I mean, we all broke, but he had a full-time job and never had any. He could barely afford to eat. But he drove super nice compared to every one of us, right? And so the idea was, is people were like, oh man, your friend, like his family well off, or does he have a lot of money? I was like, no, he just spends every single penny of his money on a car that he can't afford, right? And so this idea is like, it tells a piece of the story, but story is not complete, right? It's deductive reading is just like kind of operating a mathematical format. Thinking everybody shares this characteristic, right? And may not necessarily true. So this leads into this idea of generalization, right? When we start generalizing groups, we start categorizing groups, saying that all these people in this group share this characteristic, right? And when we do this really quick, there's a term, we'll talk about this when we look at some mistakes logic, and it's called the generalization, right? Which just means to come to a generalization quickly. It's like being too fast to jump to conclusions, right? Like if someone says like, don't jump conclusions too fast, or maybe kind of the like, don't judge a book its cover, that could be a hasty generalization. Or maybe it has like first impressions. So like example, you meet someone, you see one thing about them, and then you're like, oh, I have a conclusion about a person based off of just one thing, right? And so the problem is like, let's say for example, I don't know, like today, if I have 5 people in my mini lesson, let's imagine this is a whole like synchronous online class, and I look and there's all these people in here, like I should have more than this. This means people don't care about class, or I'm doing a job, or whatever it is. And it's like, no, see generalization. It's jumping to a conclusion too fast, and a lot of evidence. Power's out over half of Fairfield right now, and people aren't required to come to these, right? So it's one of these things that maybe they're going to watch the video instead. And so the idea is that like when jumping to conclusions fast, that's a problem because you're only really looking at one little piece of story. And if we think of that from the context DJ, right? Like she comes to a conclusion way too quick about Fide's family. She comes to a conclusion way too quick about what in Mexico must be, right? Because all she's using is she's using a little piece of evidence, just like her roommate did. As soon as she heard it was from the continent of Africa, there became this idea of like, oh, what's tribal music like? And what's this like? And all she's doing is just calling on these really quick single examples that she has and come to a conclusion based on that. Are there any questions about that? Like this is something that we're all familiar with, right? We see people do all the time. We ourselves do this all the time. And sometimes it's really valuable to come to a quick conclusion, right? Like sometimes we don't have every single piece of evidence you need. Right? Sometimes it's just like, I see this thing and I'm immediately to a conclusion, right? And so here be an example of those times, right? Like asking yourself, like, would you pet these? So for example, sometimes when it comes to a decision of what kind of dog you're going to pet or what kind of dog you get close to, we have to come to a really quick conclusion, right? For example, I was out for a walk or a run the other night, and I saw a dog that was kind of like on the sidewalk next to me with their owner, and my reaction was, do I move away from this dog? I stay close to this dog, right? Like this dog gonna sniff me? And then the reality is like they have a quick second that decision, right? So a lot of times to ask ourselves, like we go off of quick evidence. So if we look at these pictures, these two sets of dogs, right? How many people would pet this dog on the list? Anybody in here pet this dog?
Yeah.
How come?
But that's because I've had experience with them. You know,
Okay.
I've had a pit bull, so.
Okay. So there's an example. So in your case, you would say, well, I pet this dog because I have an experience with this dog, right? I've had a pit before. And what experience with your pit taught you?
What was that?
I said, what is your experience with your pit bull taught? How is it informed decision on whether or not you pet a dog?
Well, not all of them are aggressive.
Right.
You know, a lot of
Yeah.
them are taught that way.
Yeah, so already your experience is taught that not all of these dogs are aggressive, right? Like you have live variants, your dog was super friendly, maybe you're super cuddly, right? So whatever the case, like you would have experience on whether or not you would pet dog or not, in case you would. Anyone in here would pet this dog? The
I
dog
would
to the
not.
left? How come?
I just don't know if it's friendly or not. Like it
Yeah,
could
you
be
know it's
super
friendly,
friendly.
right? Huh?
It could be really friendly, but I have no idea.
That's right. Yeah, so you have
But
no idea.
But in all fairness, I don't think I'd pet the ones on the left either. I got bit by a small dog before too, so.
Okay, good. So now this is good, right? Because you would use your experiences are you make that decision. I wouldn't pet the dog right either because I got bit by a dog before. So I'm not going to pet the big dog because I don't know friendly. On the other, I'm not going to pet this little because I bit by a dog. There's no guarantee that just dogs small, they're friendly. Would one pet the dog right that wouldn't pet those on the left or on the left? Right? We don't know. I was curious if anyone would say no to the dog on the left, would pet the dogs.
I'd
right?
be more
Like,
likely to pet the dogs on the right at first.
yeah, right? Why would you be more likely to pet this on the right?
They don't have as much potential to do damage.
Yeah, so there's one like kind of unequivocal piece of evidence, right? Like these two dogs right aren't as strong. I feel like these two dogs to the right, if they wanted to come at you, everything that you two have, you could probably defend yourself against, right? Like
Yeah.
they're not terribly, the dogs on the right are my dogs. Right? So like, yeah, they look friendly in the tree and they are super friendly. They wouldn't bite you. But even if they decided they to, they're about like, I don't know, 8 inches the ground and just kind of push them away, be fine. And so the idea is that like we're conclusions, right? For all we know, the dog on the left could be super duperly. For all we know, the dogs on the right could bite you and pick at your ankles and stuff like that. But the reality is that we're using, in the case of a quick decision, deductive reason to help us with this. But then also what Drew is answering to this question is something a little bit different. He's using experiences, right? Using evidence that he had from back to be able to help him draw a conclusion. And that thing that we want to make her, and it's helpful to it's something and be able to come to an assumption at times, because there's times that's what we have to do. But there's also instances where we're drawing stronger conclusions based off of more pieces of evidence. And what we start moving into when we do that, and move into this idea, inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is there's not the same level of mathematical certainty as there is inductive reasoning. Instead, our conclusions we come to are based off of evidence and experiences, right? So evidence and being able to let that dog, maybe evidence dog's behavior, maybe the experience of having owned one of dogs, maybe the experience of, in this case, having been bitten by a smaller dog. Right? Like we're calling on more than just one piece of evidence to help us come to a conclusion. Inferences are based off of deductive reasoning. And when we think about the definition of an inference, is an inference a conclusion we reach based off the analysis of evidence, right? So an inference is different than an assumption. An assumption is you have bits of evidence and you're drawing a conclusion based off that evidence. Inference is a similar idea, except for you're drawing a conclusion based on how you're analyzing evidence, right? And the idea of drawing an inference versus just an assumption is an inference is a strong version of that conclusion, right? The stronger your inference is really only as strong evidence is. So instead of having one piece of evidence, maybe you have 4 pieces of evidence, 5 pieces of evidence, right? If you only have one, you're like, oh, that dog bites, I'm gonna pet it. Well, I say, well, not, oh, because it's bull. Not enough, right? Drawing an assumption. Now, you'd be correct in your assumption, or you could be correct. You say, one reason is because it's, another reason is because it's growling at, another reason is because its fur stands on its back, another reason is because it's salivating, right? Like, you start giving all of different reasons you're not gonna pet this dog. No, you still be incorrect in your inference, but it's a much simpler argument. You're using multiple pieces of evidence to back it up. Does that distinction between inference and conclusion, or excuse me, and assumption make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at this idea of building analysis and how we do it. So schema is really important. Drew gave us a great example of schema, and so Eric, right? Schema is you and your experiences. So whenever we thought this word schema, I mean, it's a way of thinking about everything, the way we make sense of the world around us. We have to use life experiences to help us do that, right? It's kind of like if you're trying to see something from somebody's perspective, people will like put yourself in their shoes, right? Try to see things from the way they see them to come to that conclusion. And so Derek's schema of saying, I pet the dog to the right, from a place of him being bitten by a small dog, right? Drew's schema saying, I would pet the dog to the left, comes from his experience of having a pit bull. It's who you are and the experiences you have in life, because those influence the way you see things, the conclusions that we come to about this, right? And then evidence, the way that we process evidence comes from our life experiences. So for example, maybe when you're reading, Trevor Noah's book, there's similar life experiences that you've had. And so the way that you draw conclusions based off of this evidence has to do with the way that you see the evidence. The evidence that we're thinking about could be evidence coming from it could be text in a book. It could be a picture looking at. Other evidence that we read, we read all the time. We're not reading, pages we're not just reading pictures. We read body language, right? We read situation. We read people's dynamics, right? I can tell by a situation. I could read a dog's posture. If a dog comes up to me, the tail's all wagging and it's excited, its head's all shaking, that's a dog I can pet. If I see a dog and its tail's kind of between legs is tucked back a little bit, I might stay away from it. So we're constantly looking at evidence and drawing conclusions based off of evidence. And the way to think about what what an inference is inference is just being able to look at evidence, make sense of evidence, and then be able to come to a conclusion based off of that evidence. And it's really, really important to think of this idea of, in order to draw conclusions, a lot of times you have to have the life experiences to be able to draw that conclusion, right? You have to be able to say that I can make sense of the evidence that I have in front of me. Because if you can't make sense of the evidence that you have in front of you, then maybe you can't come to that specific conclusion, right? So for example, when face-to-face in classes, one of the examples that I use to prove this point is I'll usually look around the room and chances are someone in the classroom wearing some sort of, right? Usually somewhere in a baseball cap. And in the baseball cap, usually, especially because of where we live, someone's wearing a Giants hat, right? And so if we look somebody, I can look somebody with a black hat, I'm sure everybody else in this can, and a black hat with a little SF, and I infer that person is a Giant, or I can infer that person likes baseball because I know what that logo looks like, right? I know what that logo is. So I can come to that conclusion, as I'm sure the rest of us in this room know what that is. But the example that I give schema is different. I have a 96-year-old grandma, right? And my grandma looks like, if you've seen the movie Coco before, my grandma looks Mama Coco, right? She's little, her name is Rosa. She comes around like a little walker, right? And grandma has no idea what baseball is. She's never heard baseball. She can tell you the rules of baseball. She has no idea who Giants are. And so as a result of that, if she's somebody with a hat, said, Mama Rosa, what can you infer based off of this pin because of the hat they're wearing? She would have no idea, right? Because she has no context. She has schema that she's looking at, right? But I'm sure there's other things that if we say, hey, what can we conclude about that person based off of what you see? There's schema that she has that I don't have. There's life experiences she has that I don't have. There's cultural experiences she has that I don't have. And so as a result of that, the way that we read evidence can differ from each other, right? Your experiences matter. Throughout the reading process, the way that we read things, the conclusions we come to about things, they vary significantly from person to person because the way we process the reading can be different. So this example, this is a page from a graphic novel called The Arrival. It's a beautiful book, a wordless graphic novel. There's not a single word in the whole book other than the title and the writer's name. But there's a lot of conclusions that we can come to based off of evidence, right? And so if we just analyze this picture for a minute or two, and I ask you the question, what conclusions can we come to about this family based on this picture, right? I want to look around for evidence. Tell me something that you conclude about this family. What's something you tell me about these people in this picture, this family or their house? Any conclusion you can come to.
They've recently, or not necessarily recently, but they don't have a lot of money.
They don't have a lot of money, right? How come you think that's true?
The table is very basic. Their
Hmm.
pot looks like it has a crack in it. They don't have a
Okay,
lot
so
of. It just looks very simple. Not in a bad way, just
good.
simple.
Yeah, so it looks right. The teapot has a crack in it, right? The table looks very basic, right? Like it just kind of looks like this is purely essential. Are there any other pieces of evidence from anybody else that would suggest that this family maybe doesn't have a lot of money?
Their clothing.
Their clothing, absolutely, their clothing looks pretty full. I don't know, maybe they're middle in their dress, but one could also conclude, right? Their clothing looks like a kind of simple. And we could keep looking for pieces of evidence, right? Could maybe say, well, like, I don't know, like there's like a lot of minimal stuff in the background. The pictures aren't framed. Like, I mean, we can start drawing a lot of conclusions based off of why we would think that could be. What about their emotions? What can we infer? We don't have evidence. The writer tells us anything, but we're drawing conclusions based off of evidence. What can we infer about their emotions?
They're sad.
How come? Good. Why do we think they're sad?
The man's face
Hmm.
looks really sad.
Mm-hmm. Good. Why else?
I think the way they're both looking down, kind of holding each other's hand.
Yeah, the way they're looking down, holding each hand, right? They both have that. And what can we conclude based on the way that they're holding each other's hand?
That they're going through a hard time.
That they're good. How come? Why do you think they're through a hard time?
Because both their facial expressions like line up, and they're both holding each other's hands, so it makes it as if
One or two more things.
something bad happened.
Good.
One or two.
So this is really, really long, right? This is draw conclusion based on evidence and text.
Yeah.
Right? His idea is that what we're doing is we're looking at specific pieces of evidence and we're to conclusions based off of evidence. And I can even push that. I can say, what do you think is going to happen next? What's happening to this family right now?
They're going to be moving.
Maybe we think they're going to be moving. Good. How come?
Because there's I don't know, that's a suitcase or what on the table, but doesn't look like they're staying there necessarily.
Yeah, maybe it doesn't look like staying there, and they don't seem they're too happy about it, right? They're excited they bought a new house and they're going to go move into, right? So we can see where we keep on going into this idea. Every statement that you're making, every argument that you're making, you're substantiating that argument with evidence, right? Every argument that you're making, everyone's saying, well, it's because of this, it's because of that. The thing that we couldn't do is we couldn't say, well, what is evidence? And I would say, well, the evidence or the point that I want to infer is that husband is very angry at his wife. I don't have any evidence to support that claim, right? There doesn't seem to be any evidence at all. I can say they're sad, but that'd be an assumption for me, not because I don't have any evidence, right? There's nothing strong supporting that claim. But to say that they're upset or they're sad, a lot of evidence to be able to support that claim, right? And so this book is a really nice example of basically what happens in this book about the husband has to immigrate to another country to be able to help his family. And it's an example of being able to read very, very closely into pictures to be able to draw inferences based off of evidence, right? And so we can see that we can do pictures that we can also in text, right? And so we practice the same exact strategies. Look for evidence, draw conclusions based off of the evidence. And here's an example of where we can do that. So by now, we've all read this section in Trevor Noah's book, right? This is from chapter 5 of his book, where he talks about his mom's parenting, right? And this week, we're going to be looking at the impact of the different relationships had in Trevor Noah's life. So here's an argument that he makes, right? He says, when I look back, I realize she raised me like a white kid. And he's talking about the way his mom raised him, right? Not white culturally, but in a sense in believing that the world was my oyster. There's evidence that we could use to support this claim, right? What are pieces of evidence that could be used to support this claim that Trevor Noah's mom raised him culturally white? What evidence could you use to back that up?
She tried taking him out of the mindset of because you're this certain nationality, you can only do this, when that's not the case. She took him out of that shell and tried showing him different things and to explore more.
Good, absolutely. Good. What's another thing that she did? What's another piece of evidence to support this? Something that happened throughout the book that his mom did for him. What about language? What about things that they did in their free time? What were some things that she did that was important?
Oh, got books for him.
That's right. She's got tons of books for him, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
He said like that he treasured his books, right?
Yeah.
Good. Anything else that she did for him?
She hid him throughout his whole childhood because of the situation they were going through. So that way he can still experience like a what white person in a sense would
Exactly right.
without being caught.
Yeah, and she took him all sorts of places, right? Like she showed him people's mansions. She took him to, museums. She took him to parks. She took him, like, she did a lot of stuff. She taught him English, right? Was like one of his, like, that was a big thing, is like reading. Just like for her, being able to learn English was huge for her. She made sure that he was like well versed as he could be in far as like reading and speaking and writing, right? I mean, like there were all these different things that she did for him as far as the world that she showed him. So we could draw this conclusion, and we could keep on going, right? Think of all the different things that she did, the way that she spoke to him, the conversations, right? Like there's a whole chapter where he gives example about how he used to have to like kind of argue his point with his mom, right? And be able to like convince her to like let him read certain books, or convince her to let him, do certain things. And I think that like as many pieces of evidence that we can find of this, the more evidence that we find, the stronger this claim becomes, right?
Yeah.
And so this week, what we're going to be doing for our discussion is thinking about the impact that a family member had on Noah's life. So here's what I want you to think about, right? It's just kind of help you build on this idea of inference, and this would be able to work for your discussion. Is what is an argument that you can make about the impact that Noah's mother had on his future? Can anyone think of an argument that you could make about the impact that Noah's mom had on his future? Kind of in your own words, what you would argue about the impact she had on his life.
She's the reason she's the reason he's as successful as he is.
Okay, great. So there's a strong argument that you can make, right? You would create this argument, and you're going to say, I am. Now, he never steps out really and says that in the book, right? You're inferring that. He never says, I'm successful, and I mean, he kind of does, but he doesn't say like, I'm, all over TV and rich and successful because of my mom, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times when it comes to inference, people show us things instead of telling us things, right? But instead, you're 100% right. Throughout his whole book, he creates that argument, right? Even though there's not like this point where he's like, here is 100% why I believe this way. He gives us all these different pieces of evidence, right? Where you could draw this conclusion that he is successful because of what his mom does for him. What evidence could you start to find to support that claim? So now what you would do to help you build that argument, to help you draw that inference, is be able to look for that evidence. You could say, for example, Trevor Noah's mom focusing on him reading and constantly having him read books taught him X, Y, and Z, right? Trevor Noah's mom taking him different places taught him that it's important that he learns whatever it is that he learns. Does that make sense? So the idea is that in order for you to be able to make a claim, you have to be able to provide the reader with clear evidence. And the other thing that you have to do is you have to be able to support here is why. This is that same idea, the so what that you all did with your first papers, right? Here is how this evidence proves the point that I'm trying to make. So for your discussion post this week, what you're going to be doing is going back through and just kind of looking and saying, what is the impact that choose a family member, choose a relationship. It could be the relationship that Trevor Noah has with his mom. It could be the relationship that Trevor Noah has with his family members, like you see some examples with his grandmother. It could even be the relationship that Trevor Noah has with Abel, right? Because he starts learning some really, obviously not as positive things as he does with his mom, but he starts to learn some really valuable lessons from the experiences that he has seeing Abel's violence and seeing the way that Abel, alcohol impacts Abel's life, right? And seeing that there's things that he's learning there. But you're going to choose what is an argument that I could make about the relationship that this person has with him and the impact he has in his life. And then what is the evidence that I've been able to find from the book, anywhere in the book, that supports this claim. Any questions at all what you're going to be doing for the discussion post this week?
Pretty
Or
straightforward.
any questions at all on developing inference or these conclusions?
Not so far.
So then this week, the other thing that we'll do is on Thursday, I'll have a mini lesson where we'll start looking at different rhetorical strategies and how we persuade readers with different strategies, like using emotion, using logic, using ethics, right? And so one of the things that we'll do is we'll kind of look at some specific examples and then think about ways that we can use that effectively in our writing. So I'll take this video, I'll post it up on Canvas later on this afternoon. And then if you have any questions or anything when you're working, just let me know.